consider the matter. As important as Sejanus was, he was still, after all, merely an equestrian. When a daughter of the imperial family married, it had better be to a man of at least senatorial rank. Anything less would be beneath her. Come now, Sejanus, be serious. What would the neighbors think? Afraid that pressing the issue would cause him to lose favor, Sejanus was forced to swallow his pride and drop the matter. Not forever, just for now. With his plan to enter the Julio-Claudian dynasty temporarily thwarted, Sejanus turned all of his attention to accumulating as much power for himself as possible. To this end, he decided to lean hard on Tiberius's natural paranoia and drive a physical as well as psychological wedge between Tiberius and the people of Rome. Ever since the death of Germanicus, Agrippina and her allies in the Julian wing of the Julio-Claudian dynasty made no secret of the fact that they blamed Tiberius for Germanicus's death. Sejanus decided to play up the threat they might pose to Tiberius and began trumping up treason charges against various high-ranking officials allied with Agrippina. It was all political theater, of course, acted out for an audience of one. Already inclined to believe that everyone was out to get him, when Sejanus began showing him evidence that they really were all out to get him, Tiberius withdrew even further from the public realm. He began holing up in Campania on extended vacations that kept him out of Rome for longer and longer periods of time with each passing year. Pretty soon, living in the bubble created by Sejanus, Rome began to loom in Tiberius's imagination as a mortally dangerous city packed with treacherous vipers and hostile mobs. In 26 AD, he decided to retreat to his villa on the island of Capri and leave Rome to its own devices. No one knew it at the time, but when he left the city that year, it would be the last time Tiberius would actually set foot in Rome. He would constantly send word that he was coming back soon, that he would be there any day, but excuses always delayed travel, and he just never got around to it. The truth is that Tiberius was probably terrified of returning to the city, convinced as he was that as soon as he did, the mob would riot and tear him limb from limb. For the last 11 years of his reign, Tiberius ruled in absentia from Capri. His man on the ground, of course, was Sejanus, who promised to look after Tiberius's interests in Rome until it was safe for the emperor to return. Now, there is a loose variable in all of this that I have thus far neglected to mention, who kept Sejanus's power from becoming complete at this point, and who also may have played a part in Tiberius's second and final self-imposed exile, his mother Livia, now known as the Augusta. During the early years of Tiberius's reign, there seems to have been a cordial, if distant, relationship between mother and son. She did not lack for valuable advice, and there is no denying that she was a fierce advocate for her son's interests. But she also exuded a sort of omnipresence that began to wear on Tiberius. There was no end to the snide gossip that Tiberius had been placed on the throne by his mother, and it was she who really pulled the strings of power. Tiberius struggled to become his own man, and tried to only consult with his mother when absolutely necessary. He wanted to demonstrate that he ruled in his own right, but the Augusta had her own base of support, and there would always be those who saw Tiberius as a necessary figurehead in patriarchal Rome, and that in fact the empire was actually being ruled by its first empress. Though he gave as much latitude to his mother as he felt he could, there were times when the two butted heads publicly. Sometimes she got her way, and sometimes he got his way, but Tiberius seemed unable to escape the perception that when he got his way, it was because the Augusta had relented to a petulant child, and when she got her way, it was because, well, she was the real power in Rome. Tiberius just could not win. And of course, the Augusta did little to disabuse anyone of the notion that all of it wasn't true. Almost all the ancient sources agree that when Tiberius withdrew from Rome in 26 AD, it was at least in part to get away from his overbearing mother. The depth of the enmity toward her that had grown in Tiberius by the end is amply demonstrated by the fact that when she finally died in 29 AD, he claimed that he was too busy with work to return to Rome for her funeral. But as I've said, the Augusta was a fierce advocate for her son. Whether it was in pursuit of her own interests or not, when it came to Tiberius, she was always on the watch for potential dangers to his regime. Thus, when Sejanus wormed his way into the emperor's confidence and began his de facto rule of Rome when Tiberius retired to Capri, he was prevented from wielding absolute control over the empire because the Augusta had her own direct lines of communication to her son that Sejanus was unable to block. The prefect was smart enough not to cross the Augusta, so though he was poised to completely dominate the empire, he wasn't quite there yet. Eventually, Sejanus planned to eliminate anyone who threatened his rise, but a good number of those threats sat in the Augusta's sphere of influence. It would be monumentally stupid to stir up that hornet's nest when he didn't have to, but as long as the Augusta was alive, he would have to sit on them. So when, in 29, the Augusta finally passed away, Sejanus put on a public face of mourning, but inside was ecstatic. He could now, finally, make his move. One of those main centers of opposition to him that Sejanus wanted to quickly destroy had grown up around Agrippina. Luckily, eliminating her would not ruffle any imperial feathers, as Tiberius himself hated her and wanted her out of the picture. Not only was she still beating the "Tiberius killed my husband" drum, but she also actively promoted her own sons as the true heirs to the imperial throne. Augustus had wanted Germanicus to follow Tiberius, she said, so it was only logical that Germanicus' sons stand as the rightful heirs. It was Augustus' will that the Julians return to power and not allow Rome to be ruled by, gag me with a spoon, a succession of Claudians, or that snake in the grass Sejanus. Acting nothing like the good little Roman woman, Agrippina very publicly inserted herself into politics and gathered around her family something of an opposition party to the standing regime. Her distrust of the emperor was so great that at a dinner party one night, he offered her some fruit, and she refused to eat it, convinced that he was trying to poison her. Tiberius himself claimed that the entire scene was prearranged to test her loyalty, a test that she failed spectacularly. Agrippina, unwilling as ever to back down, told her supporters that Tiberius had in fact tried to poison her, and then concocted the story of a loyalty test after the fact, once she escaped his murderous clutches. When the Augusta died, Sejanus went straight away after Agrippina on the explicit order of Tiberius. Whether the idea of trying Germanicus' family for treason was originally planted in the emperor's head by Sejanus or not, there is no doubt that Tiberius fully supported their persecution. Agrippina and her two eldest sons, Nero Caesar and Drusus Caesar, were tried and convicted on trumped-up charges of attempting to overthrow the regime. The fates of all three were gruesome. The elder son, Nero Caesar, was murdered shortly after the trial, while his brother was left to rot in prison for 4 years before being intentionally starved to death in 33 AD. It is reported that by the end, he was reduced to eating the stuffing from his bedding in a vain attempt to survive. Agrippina herself was exiled to a desolate island, and after enduring years of beatings, she too died in 33 AD, broken and malnourished. The only one of Germanicus' sons to survive was young Gaius, known to all by the nickname Caligula, who was too young to be considered a threat. I wonder if this thoroughly traumatized boy, who just watched his mother and brothers be murdered by his adoptive grandfather, is going to grow up to be a sociopathic monster. Stay tuned, we'll all find out together. But the persecution of Germanicus' family was only the beginning. Rome under Tiberius was already suffering from far more restrictions on individual liberty than it had under the confident and permissive Augustus. Throughout the 20s, Tiberius had begun to elevate every real or perceived slight against the regime to the level of capital T treason. Now, with Sejanus in total control of Tiberius, the cruel paranoia of the aging emperor was given free rein. Where once maybe a few men a year were tried and convicted of treason, now it became a daily event. Treason trials ran continuously, and a bloody purge not seen since the days of the Second Triumvirate overtook the city. With Sejanus overseeing the proceedings, it became clear early that those charged with treason were overwhelmingly personal enemies of the Praetorian prefect. Under the guise of protecting Tiberius, Sejanus was actually killing off his opponents and putting everyone else on notice that they had better not cross him. But in 31 AD, just as Sejanus stepped into a shared consulship with Tiberius, finally achieving the formal power he had sought for so long, he was undone. Unfortunately for us, the sections of Tacitus's annals that deal with the fall of Sejanus have been lost, so we don't have the same level of detail for this episode that we do for the rest of Tiberius's reign. It seems, though, that Tiberius finally realized just how much Sejanus was usurping his authority, after a few letters critical of the prefect, made it through Sejanus' screening process. Believing that Sejanus had allied himself with elements of the Julian clan and was planning to overthrow him, Tiberius decided to divest himself of the backstabbing prefect. He called an unsuspecting Sejanus to stand before the Senate to attend to some invented business outlined in a letter from the emperor that was to be read aloud to the assembled senators. To the prefect's shock, amidst the tedium of imperial business, Tiberius's letter suddenly veered into a denunciation of his new consular colleague. Tiberius called for Sejanus to be tried and executed for treason. The Senate, who had suffered mightily under Sejanus' heavy and bloody hand, immediately obliged. Sejanus had no recourse, as Tiberius had already sent notice to the Praetorians that their leader had been replaced and that Naevius Sutorius Macro was their new prefect. Suddenly, without power or allies, Sejanus was tried, sentenced, and strangled. His death sparked riots in Rome. Suddenly free of the tyrant, they tore his body to pieces and then went off in search of anyone who had collaborated with the fallen prefect in his reign of terror. Among those who were swept up in the immediate aftermath of Sejanus' death was Livilla. A slave with knowledge of her crime waited until he was sure Sejanus was dead and then addressed a letter to Tiberius outlining her involvement in the murder of Drusus. Livilla turned up dead shortly thereafter, and though a definitive account of her death does not exist, the most dramatic account has Tiberius handing Livilla over to her mother Antonia for punishment, whereupon mother locked up daughter and starved her to death. Next week, we will trace the final bloody and debauched years of Tiberius' reign. As so often happens, the purge machine was turned on those who had initiated it, and Tiberius sought to eliminate anyone suspected of ever coming into contact with anyone who had ever considered being a friend of Sejanus. It was a dark time for Rome, and when Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, the people cheered his death. Not only was their hated master dead, but ascending to the throne was the beloved Caligula, son of noble Germanicus. If anyone could put the horrible final years of Tiberius' reign behind them, it was this shining young prince. I will close this week by mentioning around this time, a man claiming to be the Son of God was executed in the far-off province of Judea. The crucifixion of the man, Jesus Christ, had absolutely no immediate impact on anything. But in just a few years, after a dramatic, revelatory vision on the road to the Syrian city of Damascus, a man by the name of Saul will turn the execution into one of the most important events in world history. Even simply keeping our focus strictly on Roman history, the emergence and spread of Christianity is a huge development. At first, the early Christians will be ruthlessly persecuted by the Romans, who will find themselves baffled by the Christian unwillingness to treat the emperors as divine. But eventually, Christianity will entrench itself as the official religion of the state, and from there, become the dominant religion of the entire Western world. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 59, To the Tiber with Tiberius. Tiberius had never been particularly happy with his role as emperor. From the beginning of his reign, he had attempted to dump as much of the drudgery of supreme authority as he could off on other people.